October 8th, 1978. A commercial airliner touches down at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. Among the disembarking passengers is a 31-year-old man carrying a Canadian passport under the name William Dyson. He looks tired. He looks unremarkable. He walks up to the United States Customs counter, hands over his travel documents, and answers a few basic questions about his itinerary. The customs officer stamps the passport. The man walks through the gates and steps out into the crisp autumn air of the American Midwest. He is in. But William Dyson does not exist. That name is simply a logistical bridge, a disposable identity designed to get him across the border. Underneath the fabricated Canadian persona is an East German native named Albrecht Dietrich. And underneath Albrecht Dietrich is a highly trained, deeply indoctrinated intelligence operative serving the Committee for State Security, widely known across the globe as the Soviet KGB. He is an illegal. This term carries a very specific, highly classified weight in the lexicon of the Cold War. If mapping out the shadow architecture of these historical intelligence operations fascinates you, I invite you to subscribe to the channel as we reconstruct these declassified programs, unpacking the engineering and the tradecraft that shaped the 20th century. To understand the sheer logistical magnitude of what this man was about to attempt, we have to look at the institutional machinery that put him on that plane. Dietrich was an asset of Directorate S. This was the most elite, heavily funded, and deeply guarded branch within the first chief directorate of the KGB. Directorate S was solely responsible for the illegals program. Unlike traditional intelligence officers who operated out of Soviet embassies under the protective cover of diplomatic immunity, illegals had no safety net. They possessed no diplomatic passports. They had no official ties to the Soviet government. If they were caught by the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they would face the full judicial weight of the United States legal system, and Moscow would simply deny they ever existed. The primary objective of Directorate S was to plant sleeper agents deep within Western societies. They wanted assets who could blend seamlessly into the civilian population, bypass counterintelligence dragnets, and slowly work their way into circles of political or industrial influence. It was a long game, but it was also an operational paradox. Consider the fundamental contradiction driving this entire program. The KGB spent years and vast sums of state resources to mold top-tier Marxist-Leninist operatives. They recruited highly intelligent, ideologically pure candidates. They brought them to Moscow. They subjected them to intense psychological conditioning, rigorous linguistic reprogramming, and exhaustive training in covert communications, dead drops, and surveillance detection. They built the perfect Soviet weapon, and then they dropped that weapon into the middle of the most aggressively capitalist society on Earth, cut off almost all direct support, and expected the operative to survive entirely on their own. They expected the ideological indoctrination to hold against the daily, mundane reality of American life. For Albrecht Dietrich, that reality began the moment he discarded the William Dyson identity. To operate in the United States, he needed a permanent American legend. He needed a name that could stand up to administrative scrutiny. Directorate S had provided him with a foundational piece of tradecraft, a birth certificate. Years earlier, Soviet embassy personnel tasked with intelligence gathering had wandered through graveyards in the United States, looking for specific markers. They were looking for the graves of infants or young children who had lost their lives decades prior. In a cemetery in Maryland, a Soviet officer found the grave of a 10-year-old boy whose life had ended prematurely in 1955. The boy's name was Jack Barsky. Because local government records in the mid-20th century were heavily fragmented and completely undigitized, the death of a child was rarely cross-referenced with regional birth registries. A Soviet operative simply went to the local records office, requested a copy of Jack Barsky's birth certificate, and walked out with the foundational document of a new identity. Dietrich was handed this piece of paper in Moscow. He was told that from now on, he was Jack Barsky. He was born in Maryland in 1944, but a birth certificate is just paper. It cannot open a bank account. It cannot secure legal employment. It cannot rent an apartment in New York City. To actually exist in the United States, Barsky needed the ultimate key to the American administrative system. He needed a social security number. This is where the grand, cinematic mythology of espionage shatters against the grinding reality of bureaucracy. Barsky traveled to New York. He rented a cheap transient room. And then he walked into a federal government office to apply for a social security card. Think about the psychological isolation of this moment. He is a Soviet operative standing in a brightly lit American administrative building, holding the stolen birth certificate of a deceased Maryland child. His accent, meticulously trained by English-speaking instructors in Moscow, still carries trace echoes of his East German youth. If the clerk behind the desk becomes suspicious, if the paperwork is flagged, the entire operation collapses before it even begins. The clerk asks the inevitable question: why was a man in his 30s applying for a social security number for the first time? How had he lived, worked, and paid taxes up until this point? Barsky deployed his legend. He leaned into a carefully constructed alibi, explaining that he had grown up working on a remote, off-the-grid farm in rural New Jersey. He claimed he had dropped out of high school, worked entirely for cash, and lived outside the formal financial system for his entire adult life. He was only applying now, he explained, because he finally wanted to move to the city and get a legitimate, documented job. The clerk accepted the story. The application was processed. The card was issued. Albrecht Dittrich was gone. Jack Barsky was legally recognized by the United States government. With his administrative foundation secured, Barsky had to build a life that would provide cover for his intelligence gathering. Moscow Center did not want him applying for high-level government jobs, where rigorous background checks would inevitably expose his thin historical footprint. They wanted him embedded in the working class. They wanted camouflage. Barsky's initial foray into the American workforce was as a bicycle messenger. It was transient, low-paying work, but it allowed him to physically map the geography of New York City, learning the grid, understanding the rhythm of the traffic, and identifying optimal locations for covert communication and dead drops. Eventually, he leveraged his natural mechanical aptitude and secured a position as an electrician. This was the brilliant, quiet reality of Directorate S operations. The most dangerous Soviet intelligence asset in New York City was not attending high society galas or moving through the corridors of power in Washington. He was wearing heavy work boots, carrying a tool belt, and wiring commercial properties in Manhattan. He was a working-class American. He paid his rent, he paid his taxes, he watched television, he drank local beer. And slowly, imperceptibly, the paradox of his deployment began to take hold. The KGB had mandated that their illegals assimilate completely into the host culture to avoid detection. Barsky executed this order flawlessly. He assimilated. He blended in so well that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had absolutely no idea he was operating within their jurisdiction. For a decade, he navigated the complex social and economic systems of New York without triggering a single counterintelligence tripwire. He eventually married an American woman. He had an American child. He built a legitimate, functioning American family. But assimilation is a psychological hazard. The more Barsky succeeded at being an American electrician, the more the rigid, abstract Marxist doctrine he had been taught in Moscow began to conflict with the tangible reality of his daily life. The Soviet state had told him that the West was on the verge of economic collapse, that the working class was utterly destitute, and that American society was fundamentally broken. Yet, as an electrician, Barsky was earning a stable living, accessing well-stocked grocery stores, and experiencing a level of personal autonomy that was completely alien to his life in East Germany. The cover identity was working perfectly, perhaps too perfectly. While Barsky was wiring buildings and raising a family, he was still an active KGB asset. He was still bound by strict operational protocols. He was still required to utilize microdots, monitor shortwave radio transmissions for encrypted directives, and funnel political profiling data back to his handlers in Moscow Center. He was living two entirely separate, highly demanding lives, bearing a systemic strain that no human being could sustain indefinitely. And as the years dragged on, the men sitting in the secure archives of Directorate S began to notice a shift in the operational output coming from their star illegal in New York. The data was changing. The tone was shifting. A quiet, bureaucratic anxiety began to ripple through the Soviet intelligence command structure. They were pouring immense resources into an asset who was slowly, quietly slipping out of their psychological grip. How exactly does a highly funded intelligence network realize that their deep cover weapon is going native? And what drastic operational triggers are pulled when they finally decide to bring him in from the cold? Every Thursday evening, at a precisely predetermined hour, the apartment had to go entirely quiet. The working-class American electrician would sit at a small table, turn on a commercial high-frequency shortwave radio, and carefully tune the dial to a specific, pre-assigned frequency. Through the heavy static of the atmospheric bounce, a mechanized, synthetic female voice would emerge, speaking in Spanish. She would read out strings of numbers in rigid, 5-digit groups. This was a number station. It was a one-way, highly secure broadcast transmitted from a massive radio array located in Cuba, directly controlled by the Soviet intelligence apparatus. Anyone in the Western Hemisphere could tune in and hear the broadcast. But without the cryptographic key, the numbers were mathematically impossible to decipher. To break the encryption, the operative relied on a piece of analog tradecraft known as a one-time pad. This was a small, easily concealable booklet filled with pages of truly random number sequences. By aligning the broadcasted numbers with the numbers on a specific page of the pad and applying modular arithmetic, where you add the two digits together and drop the first digit of any two-digit result, the ciphertext resolved into a plain text message. Once the message was decoded, the page of the one-time pad was torn out and destroyed. The paper was chemically treated to burn instantly, leaving behind no measurable ash. This was the mechanical reality of deep cover espionage. While the cover identity functioned autonomously in the daylight, the intelligence asset was tethered to Moscow's center by these invisible, encrypted radio waves. Receiving orders was only half of the logistical equation. Transmitting gathered intelligence back to the Soviet Union required a far more dangerous set of operational protocols. As a Directorate S illegal, the operative was entirely cut off from the local Soviet embassy. He could not simply walk into the diplomatic compound in Washington and hand over a file. Doing so would immediately expose him to the aggressive surveillance dragnets maintained by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Instead, outgoing communication relied heavily on the production of microdots. This was a highly meticulous photographic reduction process. Using specialized, concealable camera equipment, a full page of typed intelligence was photographed and reduced to a piece of film negative approximately 1 millimeter in diameter. It was roughly the size of a printed period at the end of a sentence. Consider the sheer operational strain of executing this procedure in a small apartment. The operative had to draft the intelligence report, photograph it, process the microfilm in temporary chemical baths, and then carefully embed the tiny dot underneath the postage stamp of a seemingly innocuous postcard. This postcard was not mailed to Russia. It was mailed to a prearranged proxy address in a neutral European country, such as Austria or West Germany, where an intermediary would collect the mail and forward it through secure diplomatic pouches to the first chief directorate in Moscow. Alternatively, physical materials were transferred using dead drops. Declassified operational manuals from the KGB outline exactly how exhausting this process was designed to be. Before placing a loaded magnetic container under a bridge or behind a specific utility box in an outer borough of New York, the operative was required to undergo hours of intensive dry cleaning. This meant executing complex, pre-planned surveillance detection routes. He had to ride multiple subway lines, abruptly switch train cars just as the doors were closing, walk through department stores with multiple exits, and utilize the reflective glass of shop windows to confirm he was not being followed. A single drop could consume 8 to 10 hours of continuous, hyper-vigilant operational movement. Moscow Center demanded constant output. They required political profiling. The objective was to identify emerging fault lines in American society, assess the ideological vulnerabilities of specific political staffers or academics, and locate individuals who might be susceptible to future recruitment by other, more expendable Soviet agents. But humans are not machines. You cannot run a piece of biological hardware at maximum capacity, in absolute isolation, without expecting the internal architecture to fracture. The institutional arrogance of the Soviet intelligence model was the assumption that their intensive psychological conditioning could permanently suppress basic human attachment. When the operative first deployed, he left behind a wife and a young son in East Berlin. The state maintained his cover at home, informing his East German family that he was serving the government on a highly classified, long-term deployment in the West. He was occasionally permitted to see them. Every few years, utilizing heavily sanitized travel corridors and secondary fabricated passports, he would slip out of the United States, travel through a third-party country, and return to the Eastern Bloc for a brief reunion. These visits were logistical nightmares, but they were also a profound psychological hazard. Imagine the severe cognitive dissonance required to manage this reality. He would sit in an austere apartment in East Berlin, speaking German with his first family, deeply aware of the heavily monitored, heavily restricted environment of the Soviet bloc. A few weeks later, he would be back in the United States, speaking unaccented English, buying groceries in fully stocked American supermarkets, and raising his second, entirely separate American family. He was required to completely compartmentalize two distinct, mutually exclusive existences. As the 1980s progressed, The rigid ideological armor forged in Moscow began to rust. The daily experience of navigating the American working class fundamentally contradicted the Marxist-Leninist doctrines he had internalized. He was not witnessing the imminent, catastrophic collapse of capitalism. He was experiencing a society that, despite its profound flaws and systemic inequalities, functioned with a degree of economic resilience and personal liberty that simply did not exist in East Germany. And slowly, this internal paradigm shift began to bleed into his operational output. If you look closely at how intelligence agencies evaluate their deep cover assets, they do not just read the raw data provided in a report. They run complex linguistic and psychological analyses on the tone, the focus, and the framing of the intelligence. Assessors sitting in the secure archives of Directorate S began to notice a persistent, quiet anomaly in the dispatches arriving from New York. The political profiling was losing its edge. The operative was increasingly dismissing potential American recruitment targets as unsuitable or unviable. When tasked with evaluating specific individuals, his reports began to reflect a defensive posture, subconsciously shielding these Americans from the destructive reality of Soviet recruitment. He was evaluating his targets not as a cynical intelligence officer looking for exploitable weaknesses, but as an integrated member of their society. He was demonstrating empathy. Furthermore, his budget requests and operational justifications began to mirror the priorities of a middle-class American father rather than a dedicated Soviet illegal. He started missing narrow communication windows. He prioritized the immediate practical needs of his American family over the strict operational timetables dictated by his handlers. For the analysts in the first Chief Directorate, this was a severe operational vulnerability. An illegal asset is the most expensive, highly protected investment in the intelligence apparatus. If that asset begins to identify more with the host nation than the homeland, they cease to be a weapon and rapidly become a massive counterintelligence liability. The operative knows the communication frequencies. He knows the proxy addresses in Europe. He knows the cryptographic keys. If he voluntarily surrenders to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, decades of carefully constructed tradecraft will be compromised in a single afternoon. By 1988, the broader geopolitical landscape was shifting. The Soviet system itself was under massive structural and economic stress. In this climate of institutional paranoia, Moscow Center reviewed the localized anomalies in their New York assets' behavior and came to a definitive, chilling conclusion. The ideological tether had snapped. The experiment of assimilation had worked entirely too well, and the deep cover operative had gone natively, irreversibly American. The file was flagged. A command decision was authorized at the highest levels of Directorate S. It was time to pull the plug, dismantle the American life, and bring the asset back behind the Iron Curtain before he could cause catastrophic damage to the network. But executing an extraction on a man who has spent 10 years mastering the art of disappearing is not a simple administrative procedure. As the encrypted recall signal was prepared for transmission, Moscow failed to realize one crucial detail. They were about to corner an operative who possessed all of their elite training, but who no longer possessed their loyalty. December 1988. The global geopolitical architecture is beginning to buckle. The Soviet Union is mired in domestic economic stagnation, their military forces are facing a strategic failure in Afghanistan, and the rigid bureaucratic structure of the first Chief Directorate is operating under immense institutional stress. In an environment of fracturing stability, intelligence agencies do not tolerate operational anomalies. They become deeply paranoid. And in the secure archives of Directorate S in Moscow, the behavioral profile of their deep cover asset in New York has crossed a critical threshold. The analysts have concluded that the operative is compromised, not by hostile surveillance, but by the gravitational pull of American assimilation. The command decision is finalized. It is time to execute an emergency exfiltration. Bringing an illegal asset in from the cold is one of the most mechanically complex procedures in the Intelligence Tradecraft Manual. It cannot be initiated through a phone call or a standard diplomatic channel. To trigger the recall, Moscow Center relied on a deeply established, highly passive communication protocol designed to bypass any electronic surveillance dragnet operated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. They used a visual trigger. During his morning commute, navigating the transit infrastructure of New York City, the operative walked through a specific subway station. This was part of his routine, a daily physical pattern mapped and recorded years prior. On a specific steel support pillar, he noticed a deliberate splash of red paint. It was a prearranged emergency signal. In the lexicon of Directorate S, This visual marker carried a very specific, uncompromising directive. Your cover is burned. Hostile counterintelligence is imminent. Abandon your current life immediately and proceed to the extraction phase. If you examine the declassified field manuals governing these Soviet exfiltration protocols, you begin to grasp the sheer logistical discipline expected of the operative in this exact moment. He was not permitted to return to his apartment. He was not allowed to pack a bag, withdraw funds from a public banking institution, or say goodbye to his family. Any deviation from the immediate evasion route could theoretically lead hostile surveillance directly to him. Instead, the protocol mandated that he immediately execute a series of intensive dry cleaning maneuvers, riding multiple transit lines, doubling back through crowded pedestrian zones, and verifying he was entirely free of physical tails. Once secure, he was to retrieve an emergency reserve package hidden in a highly secure dead drop location. This prepositioned cache contained a secondary set of fabricated identity documents, likely a Canadian passport, alongside a substantial sum of untraceable currency. The exit vector was routed strictly over land. Attempting to board a commercial airliner at an international hub like John F. Kennedy Airport was deemed an unacceptable risk, as border control checkpoints could easily flag a sudden, unannounced departure. The protocol instructed him to travel north, utilizing ground transportation to cross the porous, low-security border into Canada. Once inside Canadian jurisdiction, he was to report to a designated geographical extraction point, a specific bench in a public park or a corner table in a quiet cafe at a precisely scheduled hour. There, a proxy handler operating out of a Soviet consulate would make physical contact and securely funnel him onto a commercial freighter or a direct flight back behind the Iron Curtain. The engineering of the exfiltration was flawless. It was a perfectly designed bureaucratic mechanism for retrieving a highly valuable piece of state hardware. There was only one problem: the hardware was a human being. When the operative saw the red splash of paint on the subway pillar, the rigid psychological profiling conducted by the Committee for State Security faced its ultimate stress test. Moscow Center operated on the foundational assumption that ideological conditioning would always supersede biological attachment. They believed that when forced to choose between loyalty to the state and the constructed reality of his American cover, the operative would default to his training. They were fundamentally wrong. The operative did not execute the dry cleaning route. He did not retrieve the emergency cache. He looked at the red paint, understood exactly what the first chief directorate was commanding him to do, and he simply walked away. He went back to his house. He looked at his American wife. He looked at his 18-month-old daughter. The working-class electrician had entirely overwritten the Marxist operative. He made the unprecedented, staggering institutional decision to defy a direct order from Moscow. Consider the sheer mechanical discipline required to ignore an emergency extraction order. For the next several weeks, he continued his daily routine. He went to work. He wired commercial buildings in Manhattan. He paid his utility bills. He operated in a state of absolute psychological isolation, knowing that he was entirely defenseless against the most formidable intelligence bureaucracy on the planet. Back in Moscow, the silence was deafening. The designated extraction windows in Canada opened and closed. The proxy handlers waited, and no one arrived. The first chief directorate escalated the communication protocols. During the scheduled Thursday evening shortwave radio broadcasts, the atmospheric bounce delivered frantic, high-priority encrypted transmissions. When the operative decoded the 5-digit groups using his one-time pad, the resulting plain text messages were no longer routine requests for political profiling. They were direct, unmistakable demands. Return immediately. He burned the decryption pages. He did not reply. This bureaucratic standoff could only last for so long. Directorate S did not write off highly trained illegals as acceptable losses. An operative who refuses a recall order is rapidly reclassified from a rogue asset to an active, catastrophic liability. He knew too much. He carried the cryptographic keys, the dead drop locations, and the operational timelines of the network in his head. If he was attempting to secure a private defection deal with American authorities, decades of Soviet intelligence architecture in the United States would be dismantled in a matter of days. Moscow Center decided they could no longer rely on passive signals and radio waves. They authorized an extreme operational measure. They broke the cardinal rule of deep cover isolation and sent a physical operative to confront him. The confrontation did not happen in a dark alley or a secure facility. It happened in the mundane reality of the American public transit system. While standing on a commuter train platform, waiting for his ride home, the operative felt a man step deliberately into his immediate personal space. The stranger did not look at him directly, but as the ambient noise of the approaching train swelled, the man spoke quietly, delivering a single calculated sentence in fluent German. He told him he needed to return home or face the consequences. The stranger then stepped onto the train and disappeared into the crowd. This was not just a message. It was a demonstration of absolute capability. By placing an agent within whispering distance of their rogue asset, Moscow Center was proving that they knew his daily schedule, his transit routes, and his physical vulnerabilities. The implication hanging in the cold air of that train platform was unmistakable. If the organization could place a messenger that close without triggering his surveillance radar, they could just as easily place an operative tasked with his tactical elimination. The threat of a fatal outcome was now active. The operative was now trapped in an impossible strategic paradox. He could not simply hide. He could not relocate his American family and change his name because the first chief directorate had his biometric data, his original fingerprints, and a vast network of resources dedicated to tracking down defects. Furthermore, he could not turn to the Federal Bureau of Investigation for protection. Doing so would require him to confess to a decade of active espionage against the United States. He would be subjected to relentless counterintelligence debriefings. His American family would be utterly destroyed by the revelation of his fabricated identity, and he would likely spend the rest of his life in a federal penitentiary. He was caught in the no-man's land between two massive, hostile superpowers. To survive, he had to engineer a geopolitical deception brilliant enough to neutralize his handlers without triggering a lethal counter-response. He needed to construct a narrative so potent, so perfectly tailored to the institutional fears of the Soviet bureaucracy, that it would force them to permanently close his file and walk away. He began to analyze the internal logic of the men sitting in the secure archives of Moscow Center. He looked for a blind spot. He needed a modern variable that the aging Soviet command structure did not fully understand but profoundly feared. He found that variable in a rapidly escalating global crisis, a biological threat that was dominating the American news cycle, but remained heavily stigmatized and deeply misunderstood behind the Iron Curtain. Sitting in the quiet of his American home, the rogue operative pulled out his cryptographic materials and prepared to draft one final, meticulously calculated transmission. He was about to weaponize the Soviet Union's own institutional paranoia against them. To defeat a massive, highly structured bureaucracy, you do not attack its strengths. You attack its protocols. You introduce a variable so entirely foreign to its institutional framework that the administrative machinery simply seizes up. The rogue operative sitting in his American home understood the internal logic of the men hunting him. The analysts at the first chief directorate were entirely insulated within their secure compounds in Moscow. Their worldview was rigid, heavily dictated by state propaganda, and deeply paranoid about external contamination. They possessed contingency plans for arrests, defections, and hostile surveillance, but they did not possess a protocol for a global public health crisis. In the late 1980s, a new, poorly understood medical epidemic was tearing through the United States. It was dominating the domestic news cycle, causing widespread public panic, and fundamentally altering the landscape of the American medical system. Behind the Iron Curtain, however, this pathogen was heavily stigmatized. The Soviet state publicly framed the virus as a symptom of Western societal decay. The Soviet healthcare infrastructure was completely unequipped to manage it, and the intelligence apparatus viewed it with a deep, existential dread. The operative saw this institutional fear not as an obstacle, but as a shield. He pulled out his cryptographic materials. For the final time, he opened his one-time pad and began to encode a transmission. He drafted a meticulously constructed, highly specific lie. He informed Moscow Center that he had contracted the virus. Consider the precise clinical brilliance of this narrative. He did not ask for a delay. He did not request a renegotiation of his extraction. He presented them with a catastrophic, unmanageable biological reality. He claimed that the American medical system was beginning to offer experimental treatments that were entirely unavailable in the Soviet Union. If he returned home, he argued, he would not only be denied access to these critical medical trials, but he would also risk bringing a highly contagious, highly stigmatized pathogen directly into the secure facilities of the intelligence apparatus. He would become a biological hazard to his handlers, his colleagues, and the homeland. He encrypted the text. He transmitted the data. And then he waited for the bureaucratic gears of Moscow to process the anomaly. When the decoded message landed on the desks of the first chief directorate, it created immediate, absolute paralysis. If you analyze the internal culture of Soviet intelligence during this era, the reaction makes perfect sense. To the aging commanders in Moscow, the story was entirely plausible. It confirmed their pre-existing biases about the degenerate nature of American society. The operative had a decade-long track record of flawless service. From their perspective, why would a highly disciplined deep cover asset fabricate a terminal diagnosis that carried such profound cultural shame? More importantly, the transmission weaponized their own self-preservation instincts. The handlers did not want to physically interact with an asset carrying a misunderstood pathogen. The extraction logistics, the close quarters travel and commercial freighters, the debriefings in secure rooms. Every standard procedure suddenly looked like an unacceptable risk of biological contamination. Faced with a problem they could not solve with an arrest squad or a diplomatic pouch, the bureaucracy did what massive bureaucracies always do when overwhelmed. They filed the problem away. The recall protocols were quietly suspended. The emergency exfiltration windows were closed. Moscow Center wrote off their highly funded New York asset as an operational casualty, a tragic loss to a Western disease, and simply walked away. The medical deception had worked perfectly. The operative gathered his shortwave radio equipment, his cryptographic keys, and the remaining pages of his one-time pads. He drove out to a remote location and destroyed them. He severed the invisible tether that had bound him to the Soviet state for over a decade. He was no longer a sleeper agent. He was just a man living in the United States. But the geopolitical architecture of the world was about to violently shift. In 1989, the Berlin Wall was breached. The heavily fortified border that had separated his first family from the West was dismantled by civilian crowds. 2 years later, in 1991, the Soviet Union itself collapsed. The monolithic superpower that had recruited, trained, and deployed him simply ceased to exist. Imagine the profound psychological displacement of experiencing this from a living room in New Jersey. The state that commanded his loyalty was gone. The intelligence agency that funded his deployment had fractured. He was an operative without an agency, a soldier from a vanished country. He was, in the truest sense of the word, a ghost. For the next several years, the ghost lived a remarkably ordinary life. He advanced in his career. He raised his family. He paid his taxes. The Federal Bureau of Investigation remained completely unaware of his existence. The perfect camouflage of the American working class continued to protect him. But hiding from the present does not erase the past. A fabricated identity can withstand surveillance, but it cannot withstand the unearthing of physical archives. Paper does not disappear. It simply waits for someone to read it. While the New York asset was successfully burying his intelligence history, a quiet, monumental breach of security was unfolding thousands of miles away in the newly formed Russian Federation. During the chaotic final years of the Cold War, a senior archivist working deep inside the Foreign Intelligence Headquarters at Yasenevo had grown deeply disillusioned with the Soviet system. His name was Vasily Mitrokhin. Because of his senior position, Mitrokhin had unrestricted access to the most heavily guarded historical records of the First Chief Directorate. He oversaw the files detailing the global deployment of illegals, the identities of foreign sources, and the intricate blueprints of decades of covert operations. Mitrokhin realized that this history might one day be destroyed or buried by the collapsing regime. He decided to preserve it. For over a decade, Mitrokhin engaged in one of the most dangerous, sustained acts of counter-espionage in modern history. Every day, he would review classified files. Because he could not risk smuggling original documents past the rigorous security checkpoints, he took tiny, handwritten notes on scrap paper. He concealed these notes in his shoes, in his socks, and in the lining of his clothing. He would walk out of this secure facility, return to his private residence, and carefully type out the notes into full manuscripts. He then packed these highly classified transcripts into heavy metallic milk containers and buried them beneath the floorboards of his rural dacha. By 1992, Mitrokhin had accumulated a massive subterranean archive detailing the shadow architecture of the Soviet intelligence apparatus. Following the collapse of the Soviet state, he traveled to a Baltic capital, walked into an embassy, and offered his hidden archive to British intelligence. The exfiltration of Vasily Mitrokhin and his buried milk cartons remains one of the greatest intelligence windfalls in the history of the West. When British analysts and their counterparts at the Central Intelligence Agency began translating and processing the data, they were completely overwhelmed. The Mitrokhin archive was not a simple list of names. It was a sprawling, fragmented puzzle of operational histories, code names, and historical deployments. As the data was securely transferred to the Counterintelligence Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, American analysts began sifting through the debris of the Soviet Empire. Look closely at how counterintelligence investigations operate at this scale. They rarely start with a clear photograph and a current address. They start with anomalies. They start with administrative fragments. Deep within the translated files, American analysts found references to a specific operation. The file did not contain the current American name of the operative, nor did it contain his exact location. But it contained a highly specific piece of foundational tradecraft. The archive noted that in the late 1970s, a Soviet operative had been deployed to the United States utilizing the stolen identity of a deceased American child. The file indicated the child had been born in Maryland and had passed away in 1955. This single data point was the fatal flaw in the ghost's perfect camouflage. The Federal Bureau of Investigation did not need to search New York City for a hidden Russian spy. They simply needed to cross-reference historical mortality records in Maryland with active, tax-paying citizens in the modern United States. The counterintelligence dragnet was cast. Analysts combed through decades of poorly digitized regional death certificates, looking for a boy who had died in 1955. Once they compiled a list of potential names, they ran those names through the active databases of the federal government, searching for an anomaly. They were looking for a dead child who was somehow currently paying income tax, renewing a driver's license, and carrying an active credit profile. It was an exhaustive, grinding administrative process. But eventually, the algorithms flagged a direct contradiction in the public record, when the system revealed that a man was living a quiet, unassuming life on the East Coast. He had a family. He had a legitimate career. He had a mortgage. He had a social security number that had been issued under highly unusual circumstances in the late 1970s. And according to a cemetery in Maryland, he had been in the ground for over 40 years. The ghost had been found. But locating a former deep cover operative is entirely different from successfully prosecuting him. By the time the federal authorities pieced the fragmented puzzle together in 1997, the Cold War was over. The operative had not transmitted a single piece of intelligence to a foreign power in almost 10 years. He was entirely disconnected from any hostile government. How does a domestic security agency confront a highly trained, deeply embedded asset who holds the secrets of a vanished empire in his head? If they move in with a heavily armed tactical team, they risk triggering the evasion protocols drilled into him decades ago. If they arrest him publicly, they lose the opportunity to quietly extract the immense historical and operational knowledge he possesses. The decision was made to avoid a kinetic raid. Instead, the Counterintelligence Division opted for a psychological approach. They would orchestrate a meticulous surveillance operation, map his current civilian life, and confront him in a way that would force him to realize that the long game was finally over. The final move would not be an arrest. It would be an ultimatum. Surveilling a ghost requires a complete inversion of standard law enforcement protocols. When the Counterintelligence Division of the Federal Bureau of Investigation confirmed the anomaly in the public record and identified the target living in the American Northeast, they faced a unique tactical dilemma. They were not tracking a standard criminal. They were targeting an asset forged by Directorate S. If you understand the operational training of a Soviet illegal, you know that they are conditioned to detect surveillance before it ever solidifies. If an unmarked vehicle takes 3 identical turns behind them, they will notice. If a plainclothes agent loiters near their workplace for more than a few minutes, their radar will spike. If the target sensed he was being hunted, the Federal Bureau of Investigation risked triggering deeply ingrained evasion protocols, potentially losing him to a network of secondary identities, or pushing him into a panicked, unpredictable operational posture. To map his life, the surveillance dragnet had to be entirely passive and invisible. Agents established a perimeter that remained miles outside of his immediate visual radius. They relied on electronic toll records, financial statements, utility bills, and distant fixed-point observation. What they observed fundamentally challenged their understanding of the adversary. They expected to find a hardened operative actively servicing dead drops or probing defense contractors. Instead, they watched a middle-aged man living a remarkably mundane suburban existence. He had transitioned out of physical labor and worked a standard corporate job in information technology. He commuted in heavy traffic. He mowed his lawn. He attended his children's school events. The man was not functioning as a sleeper agent. He was functioning as a thoroughly assimilated middle-class American father. This behavioral intelligence dictated the terms of the final confrontation. A kinetic raid involving tactical teams and drawn weapons was immediately ruled out. It would traumatize his family, destroy his community standing, and instantly force him into a defensive psychological posture. The Federal Bureau of Investigation needed him to cooperate. They needed to access the decades of historical intelligence locked inside his memory. To achieve this, they orchestrated a highly controlled, deeply psychological interdiction. In May 1997, the target was driving home from work. As he approached a routine toll plaza on a major interstate bridge, the traffic flow was quietly and deliberately manipulated. The vehicles ahead of him stalled. The vehicles behind him boxed him in. He was caught in a localized, inescapable transit choke point. There was no room to maneuver, no exit ramp, and no possibility of evasion. A man in civilian clothing walked calmly up to the driver's side window. The stranger flashed federal credentials and asked the driver to pull over to a secure, designated area just past the toll booths. Consider the sheer psychological weight of this specific moment. For nearly 2 decades, the target had carried the monumental secret of his fabricated identity. He had successfully evaded the Soviet intelligence apparatus, outlasted the Cold War, and buried his past beneath layers of American normalcy. Now, sitting in a car on a Pennsylvania bridge, the illusion shattered. An agent stepped into the passenger seat, looked at him, and delivered a carefully calculated opening line. He did not use the name Jack Barsky. He used the name Albrecht. The agent calmly outlined the reality of the situation. The Federal Bureau of Investigation knew exactly who he was. They knew about his deployment from East Germany, his training in Moscow, and his operational history in New York. The agent then presented the ultimatum. If the former operative chose to remain silent or attempted to flee, he would be arrested, indicted for espionage, and face the total destruction of his American family life, followed by decades in a federal penitentiary. However, if he agreed to full, unrestricted cooperation, the government would offer an alternative path. They would debrief him quietly. He would not be publicly charged. His family would be protected from the immediate fallout. The counterintelligence analysts had anticipated denial, resistance, or stoic silence. But when faced with the absolute collapse of his cover, the target exhibited a deeply human reaction. He did not fight. He felt an overwhelming, profound sense of relief. The crushing psychological burden of maintaining 2 entirely separate lives, of lying to his wife, of constantly monitoring his periphery for Soviet assassins or American federal agents was finally over. He accepted the offer. He agreed to defect in place. Over the next several months, the Federal Bureau of Investigation conducted a series of exhaustive debriefings in secure hotel rooms and government facilities. The former illegal was subjected to rigorous polygraph examinations to ensure he was not operating as a double agent or maintaining covert communication with the modern Russian Federation. He passed every test. He was exactly what he claimed to be, a retired asset who simply wanted to be left alone. As the debriefings progressed, American intelligence analysts were granted unprecedented access to the mechanical reality of Directorate S operations during the 1980s. The former operative provided highly granular data on the psychological profiling techniques used by his handlers. He detailed the specific chemical compositions required to develop microdots in temporary chemical baths. He mapped out the exact geographic locations of historical dead drops across the boroughs of New York City. He explained the encrypted communication windows and the proxy routing systems that funneled mail through neutral European nations. While the geopolitical landscape had shifted and the Soviet Union no longer existed, this historical data was invaluable. It allowed Western counterintelligence agencies to definitively validate the raw files smuggled out by Vasily Mitrokhin, closing dozens of historical blind spots and mapping the true scale of the Soviet intelligence footprint during the final decade of the Cold War. But beyond the technical tradecraft, the resolution of this case provided American intelligence with a profound sociological insight. It exposed a massive systemic failure within the Soviet intelligence model. If you analyze the institutional philosophy of the Committee for State Security, their entire deep cover program was built on a foundation of absolute ideological arrogance. They believed that their psychological conditioning, their Marxist-Leninist doctrines, and their rigorous linguistic reprogramming could permanently override human nature. They assumed they could drop a highly trained asset into a hostile environment, isolate him for years, and expect him to function perfectly as a loyal extension of the state. They failed to account for the corrosive power of mundane reality. The asset was not compromised by a brilliantly executed counter-espionage sting. He was not turned by a massive financial bribe. He was neutralized by the gravitational pull of the society he was deployed to infiltrate. The simple realities of earning a steady paycheck, accessing a functional consumer economy, and building a genuine family slowly rewrote his internal programming. The American suburbs achieved what billions of dollars in federal counterintelligence funding could not. It passively absorbed a top-tier Soviet weapon and rendered it entirely inert. Historians and intelligence analysts continue to heavily debate the actual strategic value extracted from the illegals program during this era. When you evaluate the millions of rubles spent recruiting, training, deploying, and funding a deep cover asset for over a decade, the return on investment appears remarkably low. The New York asset never stole classified weapons schematics. He never infiltrated the Pentagon. He never acquired sensitive geopolitical secrets that fundamentally altered the balance of the Cold War. Instead, Moscow Center tasked him with political sentiment analysis, economic profiling, and identifying potential civilian targets for future recruitment. The intelligence he transmitted was largely observational. It fed the institutional paranoia of the first chief directorate, providing them with heavily filtered sociological data that often simply confirmed their pre-existing biases about the West. The illegals program was an engineering marvel of espionage logistics, but it was strategically hollow. It prioritized the art of the cover identity over the actual acquisition of actionable intelligence. Following his extensive cooperation, the Federal Bureau of Investigation honored their agreement. The former operative was not subjected to a public trial. He was allowed to return to his suburban life, his corporate career, and his family. In a bureaucratic procedure that perfectly encapsulates the paradox of his entire existence, the man who arrived in the United States carrying the stolen birth certificate of a deceased Maryland child eventually stood in a government building and was legally sworn in as an official citizen of the country he was once sworn to destroy. The deep cover network that placed him there collapsed under the weight of its own ideological contradictions. The radio arrays in Cuba stopped transmitting his encrypted call signs. The handlers who hunted him retired into obscurity. The monolithic bureaucracy that engineered his deployment dissolved into the archives of history. The ghost simply faded into the crowd, exactly as he was trained to do.